right, so hopefully this is recording. Good morning, my name is Damian. I'm here with Adam.
Morning.
So this is for our My Lai Massacre podcast for PED 4183, I believe.
Yeah.
So just a nice quick chat here with Adam. So how are you doing this morning, Adam?
I'm not too bad. How are you doing?
Not bad myself. So we are living in a global pandemic right now, and I mean, how has that affected you? Anything specific?
Well, obviously we're all working from home now. We're doing a lot of different stuff online, and we're starting to see in the news questions about where this virus originated and what happened around the world to spread this thing.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where today's discussion is actually we're going to go about is really how this virus or how the media is portraying the virus to have started and what the media has come from that. So in today's world, right now, we're currently seeing a lot of Asian hate crimes happening, anti-Asian racism. Now, the most recent one, the biggest one, now, of course, there are little and smaller incidents that are not necessarily reported by mainstream media. But the Atlanta shooting, have you heard about that one?
Yep. It's been all over the news, right? And so 8 Asian women who were murdered.
I believe so, yeah. So it was designated a hate crime. Now, our condolences out to those families and victims, and anyone affected by anti-Asian racism and Asian hate crimes nowadays. Now, with that being in today's current society and that coming and stemming from the coronavirus and the global pandemic, we can always use history to compare and explain these current events. Now, Adam, I don't know, but myself, I can't come to think, but is there any historical event that you could relate to this wave of anti-Asian racism?
Yeah, well, definitely as history teachers, that's what we want to think of, right? And the one that comes to mind for me is the My Lai Massacre, which took place in the American War in Vietnam. So that comes right to my mind.
All right. I've heard of it. I'm not an expert on that. Could you elaborate a bit more on what happened at the My Lai Massacre?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is in 1968 in Vietnam. South Vietnamese civilians were in their village of My Lai. That's where the name comes from. Mylai was the name of the village. And a company of American soldiers went into the village. They were told, well, there are various accounts of what they were told to do, but they were told to basically root out the enemy and destroy them. And we know the war in Vietnam was a guerrilla war. Viet Cong were perceived to be everywhere. And what happened was a full-blown massacre took place. The American soldiers entered the village. They took no prisoners, and they murdered countless men, women, and children. The numbers, I say countless because we're not exactly sure the exact number. The United States Army, when they eventually admitted to it, there was a cover-up, which I think we will get into. But the U.S. Army says that there were 347 civilians murdered. Today's Vietnamese government lists 504 murdered, and there are various other estimates in between, but at least 347 villagers murdered by the American Army. So what happens here, this was carried out by Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment in the American Army in Vietnam. They entered the village in the morning. Like I said, they were told to root out the enemy. There were various reports of what they were told, but certainly in the weeks leading up to it, that particular company had lost some popular soldiers and sergeants, and the company commander, Captain Ernest Medina, was reported to have said that we would get revenge for our fallen comrades. So they come into the village with this plan of vengeance, or this idea that they will get their vengeance. And when they enter, it really does become a massacre. There's some skirmish outside of the village with maybe a couple people who are armed. And then they come in, and it's a village full of unarmed civilians, mostly women and children. And they are rounded up into center of the village. And then the reports are that suddenly this massacre sort of began. There were some gruesome reports that come out of it, so I will warn you in advance, but one soldier tossed a woman into a well and then tossed a grenade down into the well, killed her. They began to just shoot in the head a bunch of civilians who were kneeling around. I think they were just kneeling in prayer together. Rape was rampant throughout this massacre. They burned down the homes of the villagers, and it was really just a horrific scene. And the reports were, it was pretty much endorsed by the company commander, Medina, and one of the platoon leaders in particular, William Calley.
So, from my understanding, it was kind of for vengeance, correct?
Essentially, I mean, the war in Vietnam is, like I said, this guerrilla war where the soldiers feel like they're being attacked from everywhere, and you read in the accounts of it from later. I mean, some soldiers are extremely regretful, and some aren't. So Kenneth Hodges was one of the soldiers who was there, and he said in an interview in an Orlando newspaper that if I had to do it over with the same kind of training and the kind of person I am, I'd do it the same way. That was one of his quotes. He later explained that they were given orders to kill and destroy everything there. If they had disobeyed, they would have been shot, and they were told not to take prisoners. And he says, we were told to destroy the enemy. Quote, the enemy was never given an age or a race or a sex. It was just the enemy. You are just as dead if you're killed by a 9-year-old as you are if you're shot by a Viet Cong soldier, end quote. So they're taking it as being anyone who is basically Vietnamese is your enemy because they could all kill you.
Very interesting. So it sounds like it's very complicated, right? I mean, even to this day, as you were saying before, the reports of casualties is like 500 to 300. That's still 200 people difference, right? So it's kind of
Complicated.
It's still complicated, right?
Absolutely, but I think when you look at some of these things, like what Hodges was saying, you know, he says the enemy wasn't given a race, for example, but everyone in that village was Asian, Vietnamese, and they were, if they had been, you know, a different race, I'm sure this would not have been the same thing because they picture the Viet Cong as being of a certain race. So that's my connection to anti-Asian racism for sure.
I mean, that's a great connection. Now, I do know that the Vietnam War was one of the very first, or was the first war to be televised, right? And
Yeah, the television war.
The television war, yeah, and be brought forward by the mainstream media, if you want to say. So, I mean, this year we have seen a lot of outrage and these things brought forward by the media. Was there anything similar to that back in 1968 for the Vietnam War, or was the media kind of covering it up, as you were saying before?
So it's always complicated, right? But I don't think the media covered it up. Who covered it up was the American Army, right from the beginning. So soldiers who were there were told not to speak on it. The company commander, the platoon leaders, they wrote their reports, and obviously it was explained in, you know, a way that these people were all clearly the enemy. The Stars and Stripes, the U.S. Army newspaper, published an article that was basically lauding the attack. The title was U.S. Troops Surrounds Red, Kill 128. So praising the events. That was on March 18th. That article came out. The date of the massacre, like I said, is March 16th. So 2 days later, they know that there was a big, I guess they considered it a battle, a big killing, but they're considering it to be this normal thing. And it's covered up in the end for about a year.
Oh, wow.
Now, when this does get to the media, it does come out. So Ronald Ridenour was a soldier in Vietnam, a helicopter pilot, and he heard about this. He heard sort of rumors. He heard from friends that there was this massacre. So he was still there on active duty, actually, while he started to talk to eyewitnesses, gather some accounts, gather some evidence. And when he got back to the United States, he wrote a letter with all of this evidence. He sent it to the president, I believe, and he sent it to a lot of other officials in government. And at this point, it did lead to an investigation, and then it started to leak out into the press. And when some photos were published, that is when it really blew up, and there was some widespread backlash and criticism.
Oh wow! So I think these photos must be very striking and moving, right?
Yes.
What kind of photos exactly were published, or did the media take and bring out to the mainstream public?
Yeah, they're difficult to see. Now, some of them are less gruesome than others. The most famous photo is of a group of 4 women and 2 children, and the women are sort of huddled. The one in the front looks to be in a lot of distress. She looks angry, and the story attached to it is that they were killed moments later, just by machine gun fire.
Oh wow!
If you study this primary source a little more closely, you see a woman in the background who is clearly doing up her shirt, and she was raped just in advance of this too.
So a lot of striking images or striking moments in one picture.
Absolutely. It tells really the whole story in one photo. Then there are other photos, certainly large numbers of civilians lying dead in a ditch. Another photo with a woman who is just dead on the ground with literally her brain, part of her brain beside her. So very gruesome photos. And when these came out, there was more of a backlash in the media, and people who already were against the Vietnam War, obviously a majorly controversial war in the United States. They came out even harder against it.
Well, now with all this backlash and all these events being brought forward, there must have been calls or like people who were held accountable, no? Or like what happened in that aftermath?
Yeah, so like I said, the American Army was covering it up at the beginning, but this was clearly a war crime. So when it comes out, the justice system within the Army does have to act, and they eventually charged 26 soldiers with criminal offenses, but only one, and that was the platoon leader that I mentioned, William Calley. He was the only one found guilty and convicted. So the others were all let off for various reasons. I mean, the common defense was we thought they were the enemy, or there was really no proof. Captain Medina, the platoon or the company commander, like I said earlier, he was reported to have kicked a woman, threw her on the ground, and then shot her. And he claimed in his trial that he thought she had a grenade, and so he wasn't convicted. Things like this are pretty common. But Calley was the leader of the platoon that sort of carried out the worst of the atrocities. He was certainly cutting down civilians all over the place, and he was convicted. Given a life sentence. However, under the orders of President Nixon, he was sent to house arrest, and then he eventually only served 3 years of house arrest before being released, and he is still free today, lives in Florida, I believe.
Oh wow! So I mean, so basically, realistically speaking, everyone got off easy, if you want to say, right? Um,
100%.
they were charged, like you were saying, but only one being convicted and eventually left basically unscathed, right?
Yep, entirely.
Now I know we are in the Biden era of presidency down in the United States. However, when Trump was nearing his end, he did want to pardon a few military officials for further crimes or war crimes. Now, it's up to them to decide to deliberate whether they actually have it or not. But I do know that there were some Vietnam War veterans who actually came forward and expressed their beliefs. And basically, what Trump had done is he retracted all pardons, and he did further announce that these war crime and these war matters do need a lot more time to be investigated and whatnot. So I'm guessing he kind of didn't want to repeat what President Nixon had done. So you kind of see that in today's society.
And he did give some pardons. to a couple convicted war criminals, I believe, from Afghanistan. And
Yep.
so this is just another instance where you can draw parallels from the present time with history.
Exactly. I mean, exactly. And the My Lai Massacre really shows us that it really divided the country even more, right? Um,
Absolutely.
with the help of media, with the help of negative cover-ups, right? The help of many different elements coming to play, it really divided the country, and that's what we see today, right? We see the country being divided with the media, with uh, hate, with racism, with a bunch of things, right?
Yeah.
Now, I mean, we're both history teachers, right? So if we were to teach this particular event, um, whereabouts do you think it would fit in the curriculum, or more so, like, how would you introduce such a heavy topic, an important social topic?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and we could talk about it for hours, really. Um, Clearly, for me, I think this fits into the U.S. history course. You teaching American history to your students, I think it's important to make sure that that course does not come across as you're praising the beautiful history of the United States. You have to explain the bad along with the good, right? And so I think the My Lai Massacre is one of the key um, examples of a really bad instance in American history and recent history. So I would definitely fit it into the American history course. The strand would be the one more recently, the most recent one, most recent era.
Yeah.
It all goes by eras, right? Yeah, poorly worded, of course. Um, but there's a lot of different issues that this fits into, and I know some teachers like to teach chronologically their history courses, and some teach by themes. Um, but definitely some of the themes that you can relate to the My Lai Massacre, issues of colonialism. I mean, why was there a war in Vietnam? The French colony beforehand, and they left. The Americans are trying to exert their influence. So are the Soviets. All of this sort of thing. Uh, Racism, another theme. Clearly, like
Yeah.
I mentioned before, um, they looked at all of these Vietnamese people. They're all Asian. They're all, they would have called them various derogatory terms. And so they're all the same. They're all the enemy.
And I mean, it's a great event that has a lot of primary source documents that are easier, if you want to say, to access, right? I mean, compared to, let's say, like events back in history, you've got photographs, you have television,
Yeah,
you have a bunch of
absolutely.
things that you can get the students to interact with and kind of expand their growth mindset, right?
Absolutely. We talked about the photos that are, you obviously wouldn't have a photo from something further back, but not just photos, like even the reports, um, military reports or public statements by governments, the language is so much more accessible when it's in the 60s compared to if it's in 1700s or something like that. So your
Exactly.
students can really dig into the primary sources and this sort of thing. Absolutely. We already talked about the comparisons to Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that's another way you connect, although those wars are really wrapping up, aren't they? So students in the future won't see the connection as easily, but definitely a connection you can make. And this idea of public opinion and backlash, I mean, this was something that blew up in the media um, and really led to, like we said, even more backlash against the Vietnam War.
And as this is in the US, I mean, and we are in Canada, one of the main things that we can kind of make that connection to would be the Chinese head tax, right? Um,
Yeah,
with
an instance of anti-Asian racism in Canadian history goes along with this one in American history. And
exactly.
you see this idea of continuity and change, really, right? Like there was that sort of thing going on in Canada in the 1800s, turn of the century,
Yeah.
and it carries on into the mid-century when we're fighting wars in Asia and massacring villagers because we think that they're all the same.
And then if you bring that up to now, right, the consequences that we've had over all these years, all these decades of anti-Asian racism, right, being
Yeah,
present, you see that in the current day society.
absolutely. And I think that's the key historical significance of this event is, I mean, the division in the country over the Vietnam War for sure is part of it. And the other part of the historical significance for this event is just that anti-Asian racism that is not going away, still not gone in our society today. And it was really evident at the time as well.
Well, it was great chatting with you, Adam. Um, I mean, I hope all your historical teachings and your teaching career goes in a great way, I believe you have a strong knowledge of the subject, especially in U.S. history, and can really make that connection between students and the curriculum.
Thanks, Damien, and same to you. And to whoever's listening, we hope you learned something and that the My Lai Massacre will factor into your teaching of American history in the future.